Hi, it's Imogen Lamport from Inside Out Style, and today we are going to talk about the 50 Shades of Grey. There are so many different greys, and it is one of those colours that can be quite tricky to figure out which is the right one of you. Now, why is this? The reason is if we think about grey can be made from mixing black and white, pure black and white, both cool, so that would make a cool, kind of neutral, but cool, but no undertone grey. That is only ever going to suit people who have a cool undertone. Then we can have greys that are created by adding increments of like black and white or grey to colours. And so what that does is gradually takes away the noticeable colour, but leaves you with a chromatic grey, so a grey that actually has some colour in it. So if we look at these two, for example, this one is a more browny grey, it's more taupey grey. This one is a more purpley grey. So these are two different greys, but they both are grey. When you look at them on their own, not next to each other, you don't notice the undertone so much. And it's only when we try and mix greys together, which is why it's so hard to mix greys together, we really see the differences. So for example, here is a more blue grey. More purpley grey, more blue grey. Again, when we compare that to the brown grey, we can really see the difference there. If we have this is a kind of more slightly yellowy grey. Do you see the yellow when you compare it to the blue? But it certainly doesn't look yellow when we compare it to the browny grey. But you can see these two greys go better together than these two because they have a more similar undertone. So here is quite a greeny grey, this one here, versus this one is, fairly kind of neutral, but even probably marginally more, and it's when we're looking at them together, you can go, oh, there's a little bit of something in there. And sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish what it is that's in those greys because most of the chroma, most of the colour has been removed, but there's just a hint of something left. And this is why mixing greys is so hard. And it's often so much easier to put greys with other colours rather than mix greys together unless you have that same sort of undertone. So it's much easier to mix, blue greys together than it is to mix, brown greys. But if I put these two together, that actually kind of can work, which says to me it has a slightly brownish undertone because they work together okay. So when we are looking at greys, there's so many different greys. And of course we have then lighter greys and darker greys. So depending on your ideal value, you're going to decide between, do I go for the light grey? So if you have light colouring like I do, go for lighter grey. If you have darker colouring, go for the darker greys. That's the other thing to think about. But when we are looking at greys, this is why it's so hard often if you're in a store to go, how do I choose the right grey and who does it suit and all those sorts of things. It is a little bit tricky. So this is why in a colour swatch we have, every colour swatch has a few greys, but you'll notice in this warm colour swatch, the greys are much warmer. And so they look much better with these sort of warmer browny greys than they don't work with this sort of blue grey. And that's why having a colour swatch is great, such a great tool. Versus if I go for something like this swatch, I've lost all my greys, where we have the cooler greys. They're much more bluey greys. You can see that this goes better with this sort of grey. Like we've got these sort of blue greys in this palette. So when we put them side by side, it becomes pretty easy to see which are the warmer ones and which are the cooler ones. But when we're just looking at them on their own, they can be very hard to identify. And that's why having your colour analysis and getting your palette makes such a big difference. One of the other things you'll also generally notice is that often a cool swatch will have way more greys and a warm swatch will have a much smaller selection. It's because essentially warm people don't have a lot of grey about them until you go grey. And then you'll usually get a few more greys in those more greyed down swatches because you are more naturally grey. And that's another thing to consider. So when you're thinking about what greys suit me, If you're cool, you can pretty much do all the greys because grey is essentially black and white, sometimes with a bit of colour added to it. But because it's more black and white, which are both cool, it means you're pretty safe choosing like a grey. Doesn't matter too much. Don't worry too much about the undertone. If you are cool, you'll find some will be better for you than others, but don't stress about it too much. What you have to care more about if you're cool is the value of the grey. So if you've got a light palette, go for a lighter grey. If you've got a darker palette, go for darker greys rather than light greys. That's what really matters. But also think about your intensity. So if you have a bright palette, grey is never going to be as good a colour for you than if you have a more muted or smoky palette. Because grey is essentially muted. That's how we mute colours down, by adding grey. Therefore, it doesn't work as well on someone who's got bright, intense, striking sort of colouring. So I go leave the grey on the whole until you're more muted, because honestly, one day it's going to happen anyway. So you may as well enjoy those brighter, more intense neutrals rather than looking for greys when you have bright colouring. But if you have grey down colouring, if you have more muted colouring, grey can be a fantastic sort of neutral to choose. And it's something I really noticed for myself. When I had the black hair, black and navy and dark kind of solid browns, and like when I had really dark brown hair too, they always were great neutrals for me. Grey never really did it for me. I had the occasional kind of quite dark grey item that I might wear, and they were the more intense, so less greyed out versions of grey. Then when I went to the blonde hair, grey certainly got better, particularly the lighter greys, but I still found that white and other slightly more intense neutrals were better. Versus now that I've gone grey, I'm really finding that grey is my best neutral. It really has taken on the best neutral category for me in my wardrobe. So suddenly my grey section has started to expand, and that's because I have something grey in my appearance. And so that is also something to think about. If you look in the mirror and you see no grey, avoid grey. It's not going to be a great kind of colour. But if you look in the mirror and you see some grey tones in you, then absolutely embrace grey. Just make sure you embrace the right undertone for your colouring. So if you've got warm colouring, go for the warmer sorts of greeny, browny, yellowy sorts of greys. Versus if you've got the cool colouring, we want to go for the more bluey, purpley, on the whole sorts of greys. But honestly, you'll find you can do all of them. So don't stress too much. If you're cool about the undertone of grey, really doesn't matter as much because grey is kind of all on the cooler side anyway. But do care about the value and also look at your intensity. So I hope this little lesson on choosing greys has helped you when you are thinking about which greys work for me. Bye for now.